In 1948, a car rolled out of a Chicago factory with a padded dashboard, a windshield designed to pop out on impact, and a headlight that turned around corners. Every one of those features was decades ahead of anything Detroit was selling. But within a year, the man who built it had his factory shuttered, his name dragged through a federal courtroom, and his company picked apart by a bankruptcy court. He was acquitted of every charge. It didn't matter. The company was already dead. So how does someone build the most innovative car in America and still lose everything? It was 1903, and Preston Tucker arrived on a peppermint farm near the small town of Capac, Michigan. His father was a railroad engineer who died when Preston was just 4 years old, leaving his mother to raise him outside Detroit in the suburb of Lincoln Park. Tucker fell in love with automobiles early. By the age of 11, he had learned to drive on the dirt roads outside Detroit. By 16, he was flipping cars for profit in local lots. At 13, he had landed a job at General Motors in the Cadillac division, absorbing everything he could about how cars were designed, assembled, sold, and marketed. That early education inside a real automobile factory gave him something unusual. He understood the business side of cars, not just the engines and the grease. Through his 20s, Tucker bounced between sales offices at Studebaker, Chrysler, and Pierce Arrow, developing a reputation as one of the sharpest automobile salesmen in the Midwest. He even spent a brief stretch as a police officer in Lincoln Park, Michigan, where he once torched a hole in his patrol car's dashboard to pipe engine heat into the freezing cabin. He got demoted for that stunt and left the force, but selling other people's cars was never going to satisfy him. Tucker wanted to build his own. In the early 1930s, Tucker found his way to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, where he partnered with the legendary race car designer Harry Miller. Together, they formed the Miller-Tucker Corporation and convinced Ford Motor Company to sponsor a fleet of front-wheel drive race cars for the 1935 Indianapolis 500. 10 cars were built. Without enough time for proper testing, none of them finished the race. The partnership dissolved, and Harry Miller died in 1943. But Tucker had tasted what it felt like to build something from nothing, and that feeling wasn't going away. When World War II erupted, Tucker pivoted to military work out of a machine shop in Ypsilanti, Michigan. He designed an armored gun turret that could rotate fast enough to track enemy aircraft. Variations of that turret ended up mounted on B-17 and B-29 bombers, flying combat missions over Europe and the Pacific. He also built an armored combat car prototype for the Army. The military rejected it, not because it failed, but because it was too fast for infantry to keep pace with on foot. Think about that for a second. The machine worked too well, and the institution couldn't handle it. That pattern would define the rest of Tucker's life. The war ended, and America was hungry, not just for peacetime, but for new everything. New houses, new appliances, new cars. The problem was that Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler had not designed a single new passenger car since 1941. Their factories had been converted for military production, and retooling took time. For a brief window in the late 1940s, the playing field was as close to level as it had ever been. Tucker saw his chance. But could a single man with no factory, no supply chain, and no backing from the banking establishment actually take on General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler? He announced his plan to build a sedan unlike anything on American roads. He called it the Tucker Torpedo, though the name was later changed to the Tucker 48 because he did not want to remind buyers of wartime. The car would be built around one radical idea: safety should come first. Now, in 1948, car companies treated safety as bad marketing because it implied their vehicles were dangerous. Seatbelts were not even on the table. Dashboards were rigid steel, and windshields shattered into faces during collisions. Tucker looked at all of that and put safety at the center of his pitch. The Tucker 48 would feature a padded dashboard, decades before padding became standard. Its windshield was made of shatterproof glass designed to pop out of the frame on impact instead of cutting into the occupants. Ahead of the front passenger seat sat a crash chamber, an open area where riders could brace themselves during a collision. The roof incorporated an integrated roll bar, and the entire body rode on a reinforced perimeter frame. Doors that extended into the roofline for easier entry, and the car's most famous detail, a center-mounted headlight Tucker called the Cyclops Eye. It was wired to the steering mechanism and would swivel to light the driver's path around corners. In those years, 17 states had laws against automobiles with more than 2 headlights, so Tucker designed a removable cover for those markets. Would any of those features sound unusual on a modern car? Not even slightly. But in 1948, every single one of them was unheard of in American production vehicles. The engine was just as unconventional. Tucker's original power plant wasn't working out, so he purchased a flat six originally designed for the Bell 47 helicopter, manufactured by Air-Cooled Motors in Syracuse, New York. To secure a steady supply, he bought the entire engine company outright. His engineers, including his son Preston Jr., converted the 334 cubic inch Franklin engine from air cooling to water cooling and modified it heavily at the family's machine shop in Ypsilanti. The final production engine produced 166 horsepower. Paired with a modified cord transmission and positioned at the rear of the sedan, the Tucker 48 could reach a top speed of roughly 117 miles per hour, accelerating from 0 to 60 in under 11 seconds. For a 1948 family sedan, those numbers were remarkable. To build this car, Tucker needed a factory. He leased what was then the largest manufacturing plant in the world, a 475-acre former Dodge facility on Cicero Avenue in Chicago. That plant had produced engines for B-29 bombers during the war. Its kitchen alone could feed 27,000 people a day. At its peak, the Tucker Corporation employed over 1,600 workers inside those walls and anticipated growing to 35,000 once full production began. But here's the detail that nobody noticed back then. Building a car company from scratch requires enormous capital, far more than any single entrepreneur can pull together on charm and vision alone. Tucker raised over $15 million through a public stock offering, with as many as 44,000 individual investors buying shares. He sold dealer franchises for prices ranging from $7,500 to nearly $30,000 apiece, signing up over 2,000 dealers nationwide before a single car had been delivered. And he launched an accessories program selling custom radios, seat covers, and luggage designed for the yet-to-be-built Tucker. Buyers who purchased accessories earned a guaranteed spot on the dealer waiting list, which mattered because the post-war car shortage meant most people waited months or years for a new vehicle. The marketing campaign was enormous. Full-page newspaper advertisements ran across the country. Tucker hired Alex Tremulis, a gifted designer who had previously worked at Auburn Automobile, to style the production car. Tremulis reportedly sketched the final exterior design in just 6 days. In June of 1947, the prototype was unveiled to over 3,000 VIPs and reporters at the Chicago factory, accompanied by the pounding of 200 men striking anvils. The crowds inside the Cicero Avenue plant were stunned. The Tucker 48 looked like nothing else on American roads. A sleek, fastback sedan with aerodynamic curves, 6 exhaust tailpipes, and that unmistakable third headlight glowing from the center of its face. People couldn't stop staring at it. Dealership inquiries surged. For one afternoon in 1947, it looked like Preston Tucker had actually done it. But the prototype had problems that would come back to haunt Tucker. Its suspension had failed and been frantically rebuilt just hours before the showing. The car had no reverse gear at the unveiling, and parts of the body had been fabricated around a 1942 Oldsmobile frame. Tucker's original engine design produced only about 88 horsepower and was not ready for production. These were growing pains, the kind of setbacks any automotive startup faces when rushing a prototype to a deadline. But in the hands of the press, growing pains became ammunition, and the press did not wait long to use it. Columnist Drew Pearson, one of the most widely read journalists in America at the time, published reports in his syndicated newspaper column calling the Tucker automobile a fraud. He claimed it could not go in reverse and described it going goose geese down the road. Those problems existed only in the first prototype and were quickly resolved, but the damage to public confidence was immediate. A wave of negative media coverage followed, and suddenly the Tucker Corporation was not a scrappy innovator anymore. It was a scandal. But who was pushing the story? That is where things get interesting. Senator Homer Ferguson of Michigan, whom critics called the senator from General Motors, had deep ties to the big three automakers and needed their backing for his re-election campaign. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, had a commissioner named Harry McDonald, also from Detroit, a personal friend of Ferguson's. Regional SEC Chief Thomas Hahn, by multiple accounts, harbored personal hostility toward Tucker and pursued the investigation relentlessly. Tucker later said the SEC may have spent more money investigating his company than his company spent designing and building the car. If you have been following this story, you can probably feel where it is headed. Hit subscribe. I cover the buried chapters of automotive history every week. The SEC launched a full investigation into Tucker's stock offering and business practices. The agency filed charges of mail fraud and conspiracy, alleging that Tucker never intended to build a real car and had simply been collecting money from gullible investors. If that accusation sounds extreme given the 1,600 employees and the functioning automobiles already rolling off the line, you're not alone. A secret SEC report was compiled but never officially released to the public. It was, however, leaked to the press. Collier's magazine published a damaging article in June 1949 that relied heavily on those leaked details. Reader's Digest reprinted it, spreading the negative coverage to millions of additional readers across the country. But the attacks didn't stop at the press. The situation was about to get much worse. While all of this was happening, Tucker's bids to purchase 2 steel mills to supply raw materials for production were rejected by the War Assets Administration under circumstances that Tucker and his supporters called politically motivated. Without a guaranteed steel supply, mass production of the Tucker sedan was impossible. The walls were closing in from every direction. The trial began on October 4th, 1949. On the very same day, the Tucker Corporation's factory was ordered closed. At that point, only 37 Tucker sedans had been completed. But something remarkable happened next. 300 employees, many of them working without pay, returned to the shuttered factory and hand-assembled another 13 cars from remaining parts, bringing the total production run to 50 units plus the original prototype. 51 Tucker automobiles in all. That is the kind of loyalty money cannot buy. The trial lasted 4 months. Tucker's attorneys were never allowed to view the secret SEC report that had been leaked to journalists and used to shape public opinion. The government contended that Tucker never intended to produce a car, but the defense pointed to 1,600 hired employees, teams of engineers and machinists, and a factory that Tucker's own vice president testified was 90% ready for mass production. In January 1950, the jury acquitted Preston Tucker and all of his co-defendants on every single charge. The allegations were baseless. The man had been telling the truth all along, but it was too late. The plant on Cicero Avenue was gone. The investor money had dried up. Public confidence had evaporated months earlier. A bankruptcy court picked apart the remains of the Tucker Corporation, and the fleet of completed and partially assembled sedans was sold at auction in October 1950. Tucker spent the last years of his life trying to rebuild. He explored a venture to manufacture automobiles in Brazil. He floated proposals in several countries, looking for a place where the established industry couldn't reach him. But his health was failing. Years of heavy smoking had taken their toll, and the stress of the trial and its aftermath hadn't helped. Preston Tucker died of lung cancer on December 26, 1956, at his home near Ypsilanti, Michigan. He was 53 years old. The massive plant on Cicero Avenue where Tucker's sedans were built eventually went back to producing aircraft engines under Ford during the Korean War. By 1965, part of the site had become the Ford City Mall. Today, one end of the complex houses a Tootsie Roll factory. The mall, like many across America, sits surrounded by a weedy parking lot and shuttered anchor stores. But the cars survived. Of the 51 Tucker sedans ever produced, 47 are still in existence today, scattered across museums and private collections around the world. They are among the most valuable American automobiles ever built. In recent years, Tucker sedans have sold at auction for between $1.5 and nearly $2 million, with a record price of nearly $3 million set in 2012. One of them is on permanent display at the Smithsonian. Another belongs to filmmaker Francis Ford Coppola, whose father Carmine lost $5,000 investing in Tucker stock in the 1940s, a significant sum for a middle-class family. That childhood loss left such a mark on the young Coppola that decades later, he directed the 1988 film Tucker, The Man and His Dream, starring Jeff Bridges. Did the Big Three conspire to destroy Preston Tucker? Historians have never found a smoking gun, no internal memo from General Motors ordering the SEC to shut Tucker down. But the web of connections is hard to dismiss. A Michigan senator with automaker backing, an SEC commissioner from Detroit, a regional SEC chief with a personal grudge, a secret government report never released publicly but conveniently leaked to hostile journalists, and a bankruptcy court that sold Tucker's factory for a fraction of its value. So was it a conspiracy, or was Tucker simply in over his head? What historians have concluded is that Tucker was dramatically undercapitalized. The roughly $26 million he raised was perhaps $74 million short of what was actually needed to bring a new car company to full production. Starting an automobile company has always been extraordinarily expensive, and Tucker's unconventional fundraising methods, while legal, made him vulnerable to exactly the kind of scrutiny that ultimately destroyed him. Whether you see Preston Tucker as a visionary, crushed by entrenched interests, or a brilliant dreamer who simply ran out of runway, one thing is beyond debate. The features he put into that car in 1948, the padded dashboard, the pop-out windshield, the perimeter safety frame, the independent suspension, the directional headlight, did not stay buried with his company. They surfaced, one by one, as standard equipment in the cars that followed. It just took the rest of the industry decades to catch up. 47 Tucker sedans are still on the road. Their creator has been gone since 1956, and every single one of them is still worth more than $1 million. The car that Detroit could not allow to exist turned out to be the one it could not kill.